Welcome to episode number 51 of Off the Shelf.
Sizofika nini kulomhlaba wakithi angipha amandla Nkosi yami ikusasa lethu isezandleni zayo angipha amandla Nkosi yami indlela yaseJerusalema asasizafika nini abanye bayathuka thina ngeke silahleke sihamba nomsindisi yebo noma kade ngihamba ngeke ngilahle ithemba ngihamba nomsindisi sofika nini kulomhlaba wakithi awungipha amandla Nkosi yami.
Hi, my name is Rod Bergen, and I want to welcome you to Off the Shelf. Our goal is to help you to know what it means to be a true follower of Jesus. Our podcast is primarily directed to followers and former followers like ourselves of William Branham. Message ministers often tell followers of the message that when they run into a passage in the Bible where William Branham's views appear to differ from the clear meaning of Scripture, they should simply put the biblical passage on the shelf and wait for God to reveal it to them. The purpose of this podcast is to take those passages off the shelf and to look at them without message glasses. We have now reached 139 countries with our podcast. If you are enjoying the podcast, please leave a comment on our website. This week, we are continuing our interview with James Manuel of Cape Town, South Africa. What was the reaction, James, in the church you were in to your espousing the message?
Well, that was there was actually a lot of drama. What now happened is Brother Stephen Stain didn't tell his wife that he was going to have himself rebaptized. I told Freddie Iso, so he knew about it, but he kept quiet. And I had to tell my other leaders. And this particular night, we had a prayer meeting. And so Brother Stephen Stain said to me, you better take my wet clothing with you because I can't take this home. So I decided to go to prayer meeting with all our wet clothing. So, after the baptism, I went straight to prayer meeting with all the wet clothing. And then obviously the pastor asked me, what is this big parcel? I said to him, I called him aside and I told him exactly what I did. This is Stan Felix. He looked at me and like a real dad, he put his arm around me. He didn't condemn me. He did not try and persuade me. He just put his arm around me and said to me that what you've done tonight shows to me that you are still searching. Shows to me that you are not entirely happy with what you have at the moment. But it also shows me a sign that there's a lack of faith. You don't really believe that you've been saved. And he put his arms around me and just gave me a bear hug and held me tight and said to me, I'm going to pray for you. He says, I'm disappointed, but I'm going to pray for you and I'm not giving up on you. And that's how, that was his reaction to what I did that night. We left there and I actually went to sleep at Brother Freddie's place that night. And from there, I took Brother Stephen's wet clothing the next morning. There was a lot of drama. 2 days later, Stephen's wife, I just heard this heavy walking down the passageway. And Stephen's wife actually came into our office area, asked the receptionist where I was, and she walked straight to where I was. And she, with a bag, a sling bag, she just hit me. And she said to me in Afrikaans, she said to me, "Jy het my man verlei. You've deceived my husband. That's all. And she hit me. And I had to run for my life. And for about 2 weeks, I couldn't use the elevator because Stephen's wife came there every morning and she would stand there and wait for me. So I had to go up 9 floors of stairs and come down 9 floors of. I couldn't use the elevator because I had to dodge Stephen's wife. Eventually, she got her elders from her church, and they were UPC people, United Pentecostal people, or Oneness people. And that was on a Saturday morning, I think 2 weeks after we were baptized. The elders of that church called us in because Shirley was ready to leave Stephen because she felt that she called him a Jesus only. That sort of, although the UPC is also Jesus only, she called him a Jesus only. And she didn't want to have anything to do with it. So there we sat that morning, and I felt, I was about 17 then, and I looked at all these men, old men sitting there, and they wanting to know from us, what is this new faith? What is this new thing that you are in now? And Stephen was very nervous. He bit his nails and just sat and didn't say anything, his eyes twitching. And eventually they looked at me, and I just had to start talking. And I remember so well, I started off by asking this one elder, his name was Brother Michaels. I asked him, Brother Michaels, you are a father, aren't you? And he said to me, yes. And I said to him, and you have a son, don't you? He says, yes. I said, but you don't call him son, you call him on his name. And then I tried to explain the baptism, how Father is not a name, Son is not a name, Holy Ghost is not a name. Those are titles. But the name is Jesus Christ, and we were having this chat, and I spent that morning talking to those men, everything that Brother Joey printed into our heads. That's what I knew, and it just flowed freely. I was kind of, quite amazed at myself speaking to these men, and they were just sitting looking at me. And eventually they said to me, young man, we really admire your courage. And they said to Shirley, we don't want any division in families. We don't want families to break up. So we think it's a good thing if you go with your husband. And that is how that day I made peace, or Shirley made peace with me. We sort of asked one another forgiveness, and we became good friends. Stephen remained my friend right to the end. He was really a good brother.
So this was in when? 1973?
That was in 1973, yes.
Which is the same year that I came into the message.
Wow. My goodness.
Yeah, a lot of water under the bridge.
Yeah.
So you, at that point in time, you started attending a message church?
Yes. Then it took about 6 months. I went back to my church. So everybody knew I was rebaptized, but I was the youth leader in our church, and I was happy there. I didn't want to leave. I still went to services as normal. The leaders spoke with me, and I decided to stay. Freddie, in the meantime, also got involved with the message, and by this time he also got rebaptized. But after he got rebaptized, he left immediately. He went to a message church immediately. I stayed, but one day Brother Joey came to us again, and he said to me, now that you've been baptized, he says, you have shown that you don't partake with the mark of the beast. So, you can no longer, light and darkness can't walk together. You should leave your denominations and go to a message church. Those years, the churches were all very small. It was like everybody had church in their homes. The pastor would have church in his lounge. And he suggested that I contact Pastor Thomas and go and visit his church. I remember they invited me one Sunday afternoon to my first message church service. And the church, I think the service started at about 6, but I was there at 4 p.m. already, standing very excited, to see what this new faith is all about. And then Pastor Thomas sent his son, because he lived just across on a Sunday evening, they had a little wall across his home that they kept service, and there were like 15, maybe 20 people. So he called his son over to invite me to his home. When I got there was a couple of brothers, maybe 5 or 6 of them, sitting around a coffee table. A whole lot of spoken words strewn across the table, and they were having a discussion. And this particular discussion that day was around marriage and divorce. And I remember sitting there and listening to these men. There was no reference to a Bible. In fact, I didn't see a Bible in sight. But the things that these men spoke that day interested me very much, and they were really talking about the woman. Funny enough, how a woman should behave and how the world out there looks. And funny that men should speak about these things, but at that time, I had a certain probably a certain need, because I was one of those young men that didn't take any nonsense. I believed that when you're a Christian, you should be different. You couldn't do what you did when you were in the world. And I saw a lot of that going on in the church where I was. At the time, when I came into the message, we were like probably 20 years or so behind America. And a lot of Billy Graham movies started surfacing in the country. And in these movies, our women folk, the young sisters, didn't wear makeup or earrings, or they wore dresses and skirts, not slacks, that sort of thing. But then when these Billy Graham movies started making its appearance, people started adjusting. Saw the young ladies wearing slacks, and they started with makeup, and a bit later on earrings, and it just got worse and worse. And I looked at this as a young man, and I was listening to Brother Joey, and I said to myself, well, William Branham must have really been a prophet, not realizing that we're so far behind America. And, just looking at everything Joey was telling us, it made perfect sense to me at the time.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, when the brothers started speaking about the sisters and how they should conduct themselves and how they should not be in the company of men, I could have, my head was spinning. But I kind of enjoyed the conversation, because as a young man, this all made good sense to me. If you're a Christian, you should live holy, and you should dress properly, and that's the way my young mind argued at the time.
Uh-huh.
And after they closed all the books, we left and went to service, and I was quite amazed when I got there. There was no electric guitar or any electrical or electronic instruments. There was just someone with a normal acoustic guitar, but the people were singing as if the roof was coming down. I'll never forget it. The first chorus that I ever heard was our loving chorus, only believe, only believe. All things are possible, only believe. And I just felt that this is what God has given to us in this generation.
James, did you attend the same church for the entire time you were in the message?
No, Rod. We initially I attended Pastor Thomas's church, but then things changed after a few months. A young pastor was ordained. Harold Beckett was his name. You probably know him. He's a well-known pastor.
I've met him before, yeah.
Yes. And with Harold Beckett, he started a completely new thing. He invited all the young men for whole night prayer meetings. And I remember we spent every weekend, we used to travel by train to Kobe and then walk up the mountain into the caves. And we would spend the entire Friday night and Saturday night just talking about the message, talking about the exploits of William Branham, praying. It was a very, very nice experience for me as a young man. I remember on a Sunday morning we used to come down from the mountain, and before even taking a bath or anything, with all that weekend sweat and things, we would just go straight into service and just turn that service upside down. We used to do this continuously. But then things changed a bit in the message, in those early days. Because Pastor Thomas, he was a very, very godly man, very humble person. And I cannot remember Pastor Thomas mentioning the name William Branham many times. But when we got to Harold Beckett's church, William Branham was mentioned probably, and not the name William Branham. They would always say the prophet said, the prophet said, the prophet said. Like every sentence would be the prophet said. It's like the prophet said, John 3 verse 16 says, for God so loved the world. The prophet said, and so we became accustomed that everything that you do has got to include the words, the prophet said, the prophet said. I stayed with Harold Beckett for a number of years. At the time, I changed jobs. I got myself a very nice job. And one of the perks of this job was a company car. Harold Beckett in his early days didn't own a motor vehicle. So I actually owned a car before him, and I became my pastor's personal chauffeur. I used to drive him around. So that's how I got involved in the inner circle. So whenever ministers or anybody comes or he's got to go anywhere, I would be driving him around. And I remember I've been in the company of men like Morris Ungren, Bob Brown, Brother Lonnie Jenkins. I used to drive Brother Lonnie Jenkins on long distances, to go and preach around the country.
Yeah, I knew Lonnie well.
Yes. And he was a wonderful man. Mm-hmm. And I really liked his style of preaching as well. But then something funny happened in those early days that really got me looking at this whole thing again. But not with a critical eye, but just wondering what was going on. Because there was this thing with marriage and divorce that was making its rounds. And the brothers would actually go around to every home. They would come to my mother and father-in-law's home, knock on their door, and they would ask, Brother Van Niekerk, was your wife a virgin when you married her? That sort of thing.
Oh my.
And yeah, it became quite terrible. And then a bit later on, it went a bit further. They would want to know whether you were illegitimate, because if you were illegitimate, you would not make it for the rapture.
Wow.
They went a bit further. There was one or two pastors that came in from the Pentecostal church, and I remember both of them had disabilities, and they used to say to these men, according to the Levitical law, you are not allowed behind the pulpit because you are disabled. A disabled minister cannot stand behind the pulpit. And all these little things started creeping in slowly. I remember our dear brother Joey, who brought us into the message when I met Crystal. He came to me and said to me at the time, he said, do you know what you're getting yourself into? I said, no. He said, why don't you just wait? And I said to him, what is the problem? He says, well, do you know that sister has a child? I said to him, I'm not aware of anything like that. But eventually it turns out that it wasn't Crystal's child, it was Crystal's sister's child. But the child was this very close to Crystal. But, that sort of thing went on all the time in the message.
Yeah.
I remember one day walking up to Harold Beckett because I heard because I was very close to him. In fact, I became his confidante, if you know what I mean. I would sit in, and if I hear anything, I would go to him and tell him this is what's happening on the ground. And I overheard a conversation one day where the brethren, some of his deacons and some of his elders, were actually organizing to overthrow him. So I went to his home and I told him, Brother Harold, are you aware that this is happening? And he said, no. I said, well, better open your eyes and go and check what is happening. And then he came back to me. He says, yes, there's these rumors and things. What must he do? And I gave him some advice and things. Harold didn't take my advice. And like a month later, that church split in two. It was very, very ugly. That was my first message church split I experienced. In fact, guys were standing with, armed with guns. Guys, brothers, deacons were ready to fight one another over a church. And that is when I started seeing that there's something not quite right in the message.
We try to keep our podcasts under 30 minutes, so we will end the interview there for this week. Please come back next week for the continuation of our interview with James Manuel. If you have a question or comment, please feel free to go to our website at offthe-shelf.life. There is a comment section at the bottom of every episode's webpage. Or you are welcome to send an email to rod@offthe-shelf.life. Have a great week, and thanks for listening.
Bayakalo mame, nabo sisi nabo